It looked like an ordinary key, until someone killed for it. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Jump into the comments and let me know where you're watching from. Your insights are what keep this casebook alive. Let's begin. The rain had been falling since the morning, a steady, unchanging drizzle that blurred the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres and made even the Seine seem drowsy. Chief Inspector Maigret sat at his desk, coat draped over the back of his chair, the smell of damp wool rising gently from it. His pipe was unlit, cradled absently in his palm. He wasn't thinking of anything in particular, not of a case, not of the weather, not even of lunch. He was simply waiting. He had always been good at waiting. The radiator beneath the window hissed occasionally, and from time to time footsteps passed in the corridor outside, muffled by the rain and the thick floor tiles. Maigret heard a constable cough. Somewhere, someone laughed too sharply and stopped. Madame Maigret had packed him a lunch, as she did most days when she suspected he'd stay late. A hard-boiled egg, some bread and pâté, a slice of cake from the Rue de Turenne. It was still in the drawer of his desk. He wasn't hungry. He had read the morning reports. Nothing remarkable. A burglary in the 14th, a scuffle outside a cinema in Belleville, an unidentified drunk fished out of the canal near Saint-Martin. Life continuing in the way it always did, with its quiet disorders and predictable sadnesses. At 11:15, the phone rang. Maigret reached for it without changing posture. Maigret. The voice on the other end was careful, formal. A uniformed officer from the 18th arrondissement. Something odd. Not a murder, not exactly. There was a man, the officer said. Name of Léonard Marnat. Found this morning by the concierge in a furnished room on Rue de Clignancourt. Heart. Failure, it seems, nothing violent, he was alone. Maigret made a small grunt of acknowledgement. Cases like this rarely reached his desk. The doctor signed off on it, the officer continued, but the concierge insisted something was strange, said the man never spoke much, paid his rent. Exactly on time, never received visitors. But last night she heard voices, and this morning, he was found fully dressed, shoes on, coat buttoned, as if he'd just come in. Anything else? There was a pause. Yes, in the coat pocket, a key. Maigret lit his pipe now. The tobacco crackled softly. What kind of key? A large one, like for a door. But not for this building. We tried it on every lock. And? It doesn't fit anywhere. The concierge says he never carried keys before. Said he always knocked for her to let him in. That's why she remembers. Maigret puffed once, slowly. All right, he said. I'll come. He hung up and stood, brushing the crumbs of tobacco from his trousers. His coat was still damp, but he put it on anyway. Outside, Paris was a city under umbrellas. Grey sidewalks slick with rain, the smell of hot metal from the tram lines, the hiss of tires on wet stone. He took his time walking. The rain wasn't heavy enough to require shelter, and he had always preferred to arrive a little late, when the dust of procedure had settled. At the corner of Rue de Petit Champ, he paused beneath an awning to light his pipe again, cupping the flame with his broad hand. A boy ran past with a satchel over one shoulder, scattering pigeons. Across the street, a baker wiped steam from his window pane with a rag and leaned out to stare at the rain, as if waiting for someone who wouldn't come. The boarding house on Rue de Clignancourt was one of those narrow 4-story buildings, with a blackened stone facade and a green sign above the door that read, Chambre meublée, the sort of place where names meant little and silence was encouraged. A thin woman with a frizzy chignon opened the door before he rang. She was in a housecoat, barefoot, and carried a broom under one arm. "You're Maigret," she said. Not a question. He nodded. Come in. He's still upstairs, second floor, left side. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and bleach. Maigret paused at the stairs. You said you heard voices last night. The woman blinked. Her lips pursed. Yes, around midnight. Just for a minute or two. I couldn't make out the words, but I know his voice, and slow, soft, like someone used to not being noticed. And the other was sharper, nervous. A woman, maybe. Maigret made no comment. He started up the stairs slowly, his heavy shoes creaking on the boards. The door to the furnished room stood open. A young officer waited inside, notebook in hand. The room was barely furnished. Bed, wardrobe, writing table, a single chair. The window was open, and the curtains fluttered slightly in the cold draught. On the floor a pair of glasses lay folded, set neatly beside the rug. The body had been removed, but the room still held its shape. Anything missing? Maigret asked. The officer shook his head. We found a wallet with a few francs, no letters, no suitcase, just a raincoat on the hook. Maigret moved toward the coat. It was dark grey, old but clean, the kind of thing a modest clerk might wear. He reached into the pocket and pulled out the key. It was large, ornate, and old-fashioned, a kind of skeleton key, but clearly designed for a specific lock, worn with use. There was no tag, no ribbon, no initials. He weighed it in his palm. Have it. Photographed, he said. Then he looked around again, and not for something specific, but for something wrong. A rug that was too straight. A pillow indented in the wrong way. But everything was almost too ordinary. He stepped to the window and looked out. The view was of a grey courtyard. A dog barked somewhere, then fell silent. Maigret stood there for a long time, pipe in hand, eyes distant. The room gave him a feeling, not suspicion, not yet, but the faint sense of a story someone was trying too hard to keep simple. He turned to the officer. Was he married? No record of it. The concierge said he lived alone. Maigret nodded. He didn't die alone. He pocketed the key more gently than necessary. Outside, the rain had turned to a fine mist, clinging to his collar like a question left unsaid. Maigret had not said a word during the tram ride back to the Quai des Orfèvres. The rain had softened to a cold mist that seemed to hang in the air rather than fall. The windows of the tram were fogged, and passengers sat hunched in silence, their coats damp and their faces slack with late-morning fatigue. One woman coughed softly into a handkerchief. A man beside her rubbed his knuckles and stared at the floor as if trying to remember something he'd forgotten. The key in Maigret's pocket was a small weight, not heavy in itself, but nagging, like the echo of a name on the tip of the tongue. He didn't know why it had unsettled him. Keys were common, after all, forgotten, lost, copied. But there was something about its presence, old, used, hidden in the pocket of a man who, by all accounts, had never locked a door in his life. Back at the office, Maigret paused by the window and lit his pipe. He could see the glistening street below, the glimmer of red tail-lights in the mist, and a policeman walking a beat with his collar turned up against the cold. The radiator clanged softly beside him, but he didn't sit down. Inspector Janvier entered without knocking, carrying a small file folder. Leonard Marnat, he said. Born in Lyon, 56 years old. Former railway clerk, no children, no criminal record. Last known job was with a timber export firm, clerical work. Left that post a year ago. After that, nothing official. No health insurance activity, no change of address filings, no known next of kin. Quiet man, Maigret murmured. Janvier nodded. Seems so. The neighbors barely noticed him. Did you speak with the concierge again? She says he received no letters, no phone calls. Occasionally went out in the evenings, always alone. Maigret turned to the desk and took the key from his coat pocket. He placed it on the blotter, studying it again under the desk lamp. The teeth were worn, the handle smoothed by years of handling. A door key, certainly, but not one of modern cut. "There was someone with him last night," he said. She heard a voice, nervous, female. Janvier raised an eyebrow. "A woman?" "Could be, or a young man. A certain kind of nervousness has a pitch." Janvier pulled out a small notebook. "You want me to canvass the neighborhood?" "Not yet." "Check the local cafés, the tabacs?" Maigret shook his head. "Bring me the concierge, Madame Derouet." "Yes, bring her here." Janvier hesitated only a second, then turned and left. Maigret sat down, heavily, his pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling. He wasn't trying to solve anything yet. That wasn't how it worked. There was no equation to balance, no clever riddle to untangle. First came the weight of the room, the smell of the walls, the stories that didn't speak loud enough to be noticed. For unless one waited. When Madame Derouet arrived, she wore a navy coat with a fur collar and clutched a black handbag as if someone might try to take it from her. Her face was pale and pinched, her hair neatly arranged in the same frizzy bun Maigret had seen earlier. She perched on the chair opposite him like someone waiting for her number at the butcher. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Would you like some coffee?" She shook her head. "No, thank you, monsieur." "You've managed the boarding house how long?" 8 years. "And Monsieur Marnat had been living there how long?" "About 2 years. Maybe a little more." "He spoke little, I understand." She nodded. "Always polite, paid on time, never caused trouble, but quiet. Too quiet, if you ask me. Like someone afraid to speak too much." Maigret said nothing, let the silence settle. "He never used a key," she added. "That's why it seemed odd." "You always let him in?" "He'd knock, or I'd hear him come up the steps and open the door for him. He said he'd lost keys too many times, preferred it that way." "And last night?" "I heard him come in, around midnight. Maybe a few minutes before I was still awake, had some pain in my hip. He came in, I heard voices muffled, the floor creaked. I thought maybe he had company for once." Maigret leaned forward slightly. "Did you hear anything more, a name, a phrase?" She hesitated. "There was something, a phrase. I can't be sure." "Try." She looked down into her handbag, as if the answer might be folded inside. "I think I heard, 'Why did you bring me here?' Or maybe, 'Why did you come here?' Something like that." He nodded slowly. "Thank you." She stood up, uncertain. "One more thing," Maigret said. "Did he ever receive letters? Anything at all?" "Only once. I remember because the envelope had a blue ribbon on it, perfume. He didn't open it in front of me, just took it and walked upstairs." "When was this?" "Oh, months ago, maybe December, before Christmas." "And you never saw the sender?" "No." Maigret thanked her again and signaled Janvier to escort her out. Alone once more, he picked up the key and turned it in his fingers. A ribbon, a perfume. And now a voice saying, "Why did you bring me here?" The image of the boarding house rose in his mind, the tight hallway, the smell of damp linoleum, the sense of something left unsaid in the room upstairs. Maigret tapped the key against the desktop gently. The tragedy of people like Leonard Marnat was that they tried to live invisibly. But invisible people often carried the deepest secrets, because they had nowhere to place them but inside themselves. He stood and went to the filing cabinet, rifling through the top drawer. After a moment he retrieved a small beige envelope. From inside he took a thin stack of reports, unsolved petty complaints from the last year, domestic disputes, disturbances, anonymous letters. One dated December 14th caught his eye, a note delivered anonymously to a woman living in the 9th arrondissement. The complaint was vague. The letter had no threat but left her disturbed. The note had said only, "You'll regret the key if you use it again." It was likely nothing. But it was the sort of thread Maigret followed, not because it was promising, but because it pulled a little. He made a quiet call to the station in the 9th. The woman's name was Aline Lemoine, lived alone, a part-time piano teacher. He scribbled the name on a piece of paper and folded it into his pocket beside the key. Outside, the rain had stopped. But the sky remained low and grey, pressing down like a ceiling that hadn't been repainted in years. Maigret put on his coat and headed for the door, not in a hurry. He knew now what he wanted to find. Not the solution, but the scent of a story, hiding behind routine, a nervous voice in the night, a man who lived without a key and a woman who had once sent a ribboned letter that no one saw again. Maigret walked the length of Rue Lafayette at a steady pace, his hands sunk deep into his coat pockets, pipe unlit and forgotten. He crossed through Place d'Estienne d'Orvey and past the looming shadow of Église de la Trinité, where a funeral procession was just slipping inside. Black coats, veiled hats, the slow movement of people with nowhere else to be. He watched them for a moment without slowing, then continued into the narrower streets that formed the quiet ribs of the 9th arrondissement. Rue Condorcet was the kind of street one could miss entirely unless they knew to look for it. It sloped, gently, lined with narrow buildings that bore the faded elegance of an earlier century. Windows were shuttered in soft greens and creams. Potted plants sat on sills like sentries. Maigret checked the number on a small brass plate beside the door. 42 bis, a buzzer. He pressed it once. A woman's voice answered, low and uncertain. "Yes?" "Chief Inspector Maigret, may I speak with you for a few minutes, madame?" A silence, then a soft click. The door opened without ceremony. He climbed the dim staircase slowly. The building smelled faintly of beeswax and sheet. Music, that curious mix of wood polish and old paper that clings to apartments where music is studied more than played. On the second floor, the door to the right was ajar. A woman stood just inside, her figure slim, wrapped in a grey cardigan, over a dress that might once have been navy. Her hair was auburn, swept loosely back, but there was something disordered in it, as though she'd been thinking too long. She could have been 40 or younger, but her eyes carried the residue of someone older. "Madame Lemoine?" She nodded, her hands clasped together. "Please come in." The apartment was small but immaculate. A pianette stood against the far wall, open, with a single sheet of music resting on the stand. A vase of wilting roses sat beside it. Everything in the room suggested discretion, not quite sadness, more like resignation. Maigret remained standing. "I'd like to ask you about a letter you reported receiving in December," he said. She gave a small nod and gestured toward a chair. He declined it with a slight movement of his hand. "It was handwritten," she said. "No signature. The envelope had no return address, but the note inside, it made me uneasy. Do you still have it?" She turned and crossed to a narrow drawer beneath the sideboard. From it she produced a folded sheet of notepaper. She handed it to him without expression. He unfolded it carefully. "You'll regret the key if you use it again." Maigret said nothing at first. He read it twice, then he looked up. What key was it referring to? She bit her lip and shook her head. "I don't know. But you reported it." "Yes, because the wording frightened me. The tone. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it felt personal." "Did you show it to anyone else?" "No." "Why not?" She gave a soft, helpless laugh. "I live alone. There's no one to show it to. Maigret looked around the room again. There was no clutter, not even a sense of dust. It was a room designed to avoid questions. "Do you know a man named Leonard Marna?" The name didn't startle her, but she looked away quickly. Her hand went to her shoulder, rubbed lightly at the fabric of her sleeve. "Yes," she said after a pause. "A long time ago." "How long?" 4 years. Perhaps 5. "Were you close?" "We met at a friend's apartment, a dinner. He was kind, quiet, but he had a sadness in him that I couldn't name. We saw each other a few times, nothing dramatic." "Did you send him a letter recently?" Her lips tightened. "No." He waited. "Well, I did once last winter. I was going through some papers and found an old photograph. It made me think of him. I thought perhaps he might like to know he was remembered." "You put a ribbon on the envelope?" She looked up, surprised. "Yes, a habit I have. I didn't think it meant anything." "Do you remember what you wrote?" "No, it was short, a few lines. I didn't sign it." "You wrote it by hand?" "Yes." Maigret pulled the key from his pocket, resting it in the center of his palm. "Have you seen this before?" She stared at it for a long moment, not speaking. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side. When she finally answered, her voice was dry. "No. But it means something to you." "I didn't say that." "No?" Maigret said calmly. "You didn't." She crossed to the window, looking out into the pale light. From below came the sound of a car horn, sharp and short, then fading into nothing. She spoke again without turning. "There was a room once, near Parc Monceau. He had a key to it, a place no one knew about, just a room barely furnished. He said it was where he went to think." "Was it yours?" She shook her head. "No. But he took me there once." "Was that when the relationship ended?" She turned and looked at him fully. There was no ending. It just stopped, like a clock running down. I didn't ask why. Maigret pocketed the key. "Would you mind if someone from the station came by later with a handwriting sample, just to compare the note?" She nodded. There was no protest in her. He stepped toward the door. "Madame Lemoine," he said gently. "Did you see him again?" She paused. A moment passed. "No." Then, after another second, "I wanted to, but I didn't know where to look." He gave her a slow nod, then left without a word. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, a pale silver showing through the thinning clouds. A street musician was setting up beneath the arch of a building, adjusting the strap of an old accordion. A boy watched him from across the street, fascinated. Maigret lit his pipe and leaned for a moment against the cold stone wall. The note, the ribbon, the unspoken familiarity with the key. She had known more than she was willing to say, but not in a way that felt deceitful. She wasn't hiding something criminal. She was hiding pain. He didn't yet know what the room near Parc Monceau had to do with the death, but he sensed a thread, a quiet place kept apart from the rest of life, a key to something not meant for the world. And someone else had known about it, someone jealous or frightened. He started walking again. He needed to visit the precinct in the 17th. Parc Monceau was their district. There might be records, property files, room rentals, old complaints, maybe even a door the key still fit. And he wanted to look at Marnat's past addresses again. Not the official ones, the forgotten ones, the ones that didn't leave a paper trail. He moved into the flow of foot traffic, not quickly, not slowly, like someone following a sound they hadn't heard in years. The precinct in the 17th arrondissement was a narrow building with high windows that looked out onto a linden-lined boulevard. The interior smelled of paper and sweat, a bureaucratic perfume that clung to the walls and made even time seem reluctant to move. Maigret arrived just after 2 o'clock, greeted by a young sergeant with a slightly ink-stained collar and the wary eagerness of someone who had only recently received his stripes. "I'm looking for records of furnished room rentals near Parc Monceau," Maigret said, his pipe clamped unlit between his teeth, "particularly any registered under the name Leonard Marnat, but not official leases, private sublets, monthly. Roomlets, quiet places." The sergeant nodded, already half turning toward a corridor of filing cabinets. "We have a registry from the housing inspector's visits. Some landlords list their rooms to stay legal, even if they don't want attention." They settled at a long wooden table littered with scuffed manila folders. The sergeant opened one marked Meublé Privé, 17 Weimar, and thumbed through the fragile pages with care. Maigret leaned in as he scanned. "There," the sergeant said, tapping the page. "Room 3, 14 Rue Geoffroy d'Abon, rented intermittently. Over several years. One name matches, Marnat Leonard, listed 2 years ago, 1 month rental, paid cash." "Is the room still registered?" The young man checked. "Yes, currently vacant." Maigret jotted the address into his notebook and stood. "Merci." Outside, the light had grown brighter. The clouds were thinning into streaks across the afternoon sky, though the pavement still shimmered with damp. Maigret walked toward Rue Geoffroy d'Abon at a thoughtful pace, his hand occasionally brushing the key in his pocket like one might check an old scar. Number 14 was a beige building with shuttered windows and a narrow door painted a sickly green. It stood on a quiet corner, across from a bakery that had just pulled a tray of croissants from the oven. The scent of warm butter drifted faintly across the air. Maigret rang twice and waited. A man in his 60s opened the door. He wore suspenders over a yellowing undershirt and had the wary look of a landlord who had learned not to ask too many questions. "Chief Inspector Maigret," Maigret said calmly. "May I ask you about a room you rent?" The man grunted, stepping to a side without protest. The interior was dim and narrow, with worn carpeting that muffled footsteps. The man led him up a tight staircase, his fingers trailing the wall. At the landing he paused before a door with peeling white paint. "Room 3, he said. "Hasn't been used in a while. Last one to take it was quiet, paid on time. Never bothered anyone." "Leonard Marnat?" "That's the one." Maigret nodded. "Do you have the key?" The man fished in his pocket and produced a small ring with 2 heavy keys. He passed one to Maigret. It didn't match the one in Maigret's coat. The inspector retrieved his own and compared the teeth. Different entirely. "This doesn't fit the lock," Maigret said quietly. The man scratched his chin. "Odd. Maybe he changed it." "Some tenants do. I don't always ask." Maigret inserted Marnat's key into the door's lock. It turned with a soft, yielding click. Inside, the air was stale. The room was small, a narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a small table with a lamp that hadn't been used in some time. Dust lined the windowsill, but the room didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. Maigret stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He could hear the landlord retreating down the stairs, the creak of each step fading until the house held its breath again. He moved slowly, touching nothing at first, just letting the space speak. The bed was made out too neatly, corners tucked, blanket smooth, as if someone had been careful not to leave a trace. There was no clutter, no soap at the wash basin, no towel. The small closet held a single wooden hanger and nothing else. He checked the drawer in the nightstand. Empty. Then he noticed something at the base of the table lamp. A matchbox, cheap cardboard, the kind handed out in tabacs, but the brand was from Dieppe. Maigret turned it in his hand. 3 matches remained. The rest were missing. He pocketed it. There was a small waste bin beneath the table. He tilted it. At the bottom, crushed almost flat, was a wrapper, waxy red and white. He smoothed it out on the windowsill. Bonbons au miel, a brand he knew, favored by older women, and occasionally left on the counter by piano teachers. He stared out the window. Across the street, a woman carried a small dog in her arms. Tram clattered past. The world was unchanged, but in this room someone had come, waited, and left again. He sat on the edge of the bed. He wasn't looking for evidence, not exactly. He was trying to feel what Maigret had felt, why he had come here, why he had kept the key, and who might have joined him in this room so long ago. He imagined Maigret unlocking the door late at night, a woman beside him or behind him, nervous, hesitant, voices low, regretful. And yet there was no drama here, no trace of passion or violence, just silence. He stood and took one last look around. On the floor behind the dresser, something small and metallic caught the light. A button. He bent down, retrieved it, pearl-colored, too fine for a man's coat. He placed it in a handkerchief and folded it away. In the corridor, he locked the door again and handed the key back to the landlord. "Let me know if anyone inquires about the room." The man gave a tight nod. Back on the street, Maigret lit his pipe at last. The flame flickered against the breeze. The honey-sweet wrapper, the matchbox from Dieppe, the delicate button, none of them were damning. But they formed a picture, not yet a portrait, but a suggestion of one. He returned to the precinct just before 4 o'clock and handed the UE items to Janvier for cataloguing. "Anything new on Maigret?" he asked. Janvier handed him a slim sheet of paper. "A curious thing," he said. Maigret's last known employer, the timber firm, had a secretary named René Charvet. Left the company around the same time he did. No forwarding address. "Did you speak to anyone there?" They remembered her. Said she and Maigret used to take lunch together, quietly. She never said much. Maigret stared at the name. "Charvet," he said softly. "Try to find her." He tapped the edge of the matchbox against the desk, gently, thoughtfully. And then, as if struck by something faint but persistent, he murmured to himself, almost too softly to hear, "She was afraid of the key." The hours between late afternoon and evening always carried a particular quiet, especially in the quai des Orfèvres. The phones rang less frequently. Typewriters slowed. The clatter of boots in the hall gave way to muted steps, like people no longer trying to make themselves heard. It was during this lull that Maigret found himself once again at his window, watching the light fade into the slate-grey rooftops of Paris, the outline of chimneys smudged against the pale sky. Janvier re-entered, a coat slung over one arm, a file folder under the other. "I asked around about René Charvet," he said. "Not easy. She left no address when she quit the timber firm, and her name doesn't appear in any of the municipal updates." "Nothing at all?" Maigret asked without turning. "Well," Janvier said, placing the folder on the desk, "there's a René Charvet living under a different surname. Registered last spring in the 20th. Married name Fournel. Works evenings at a stationery shop off Rue des Pyrénées. No husband listed." Maigret's pipe had gone out. He tapped it gently against the ashtray and refilled it without haste. "Do we have an address?" Janvier slid a note across the desk. "4th floor walk-up. Nothing fancy." Maigret looked at it and gave a soft grunt of acknowledgement. "Did she give a date of birth when she registered?" Janvier nodded. "Same as the one listed in the timber firm's employment file. It's her. Then she'll recognize the name Maigret." "Yes," Janvier said, lowering his voice slightly. "I'd wager she already has." Maigret left the quai, As the street lamps were flickering on one by one, their glow trembling slightly in the mist that had begun to descend over the city. The rain hadn't returned, but the humidity was thick, the kind that soaked into one's coat and collar. He walked without rush, letting the city change shape around him, the broad boulevards narrowing into tighter, noisier streets as he entered the 20th arrondissement. The shop was still open, a narrow storefront painted pale blue with faded gold letters reading Papeterie Fournel. Inside, shelves lined with notebooks, pens, and stacks of lined paper gave the place a schoolteacher's warmth. Behind the counter stood a woman in a burgundy blouse, sleeves rolled halfway up her forearms, sorting envelopes into little compartments. She didn't look up when he entered. "Madame Fournel." She turned. Her face was sharper than Aline. Lemoine's thinner, more drawn, but something in the posture, the quick scan of his coat and eyes, told Maigret she already suspected who he was. "Yes?" He took off his hat. "Chief Inspector Maigret." She nodded slowly, her hands still resting on the counter. "Of course. I thought perhaps you might come." He said nothing, merely waited. "I read about it," she added. "A man found dead in a room he didn't belong to." "That's an interesting phrase," Maigret said quietly. Her mouth twitched at the corner. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded. How long did you know Marnat?" She looked toward the back of the shop, then motioned for him to follow her. A narrow staircase led up to a cramped apartment above. It smelled faintly of lavender and old varnish. In the small sitting room, she gestured for him to take the armchair. She didn't sit. "I worked with him for 4 years," she said. "Maybe longer. We had desks 2 meters apart." "Was it only work?" She met his gaze. "No." He gave her time. "We used to meet for coffee," she said. "He never liked cafés, said they were too loud. So we met in quiet places. Walks. Rooms sometimes. He was careful, always careful, like he expected someone to follow him." "Did you know about the room near Parc Monceau?" "Yes." "Did you ever go there?" "Yes." "And recently?" She paused. "No." "Did you see him in the last month?" "No." Her voice was steady, almost too steady. "Then let me ask," Maigret said. "Did you send him a note? A letter?" Her eyes dropped for a fraction of a second. Then she walked to a cupboard and pulled out a small biscuit tin. Inside were envelopes, photographs, and small slips of paper, folded into neat squares. She handed him a sealed envelope. "I wrote this the night I heard he died. I didn't post it. I wasn't sure it mattered." Maigret didn't open it. He slipped it into his pocket. "Did he ever give you anything?" he asked. "A key, for example?" She turned her back to him. Her hand went to the shelf beside the window. A small wooden box, lacquered, the kind given as a gift. From it, she took a second key, long, heavy, almost identical to the one in Maigret's coat. She handed it over without a word. Maigret held it beside the original. Same make, slightly more worn at the teeth. "He gave it to you?" "Yes, but I never used it again after we ended." "Why did you end it?" She didn't answer right away. She poured herself a small glass of wine from a bottle on the counter, didn't offer him one. "He began to disappear," she said, "not physically, emotionally. He'd sit with me, and I could feel he wasn't there, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear." Maigret nodded slowly. "Did you write a note to someone else?" he asked. "A warning, perhaps?" Her gaze narrowed. "To whom?" "To Aline Lemoine." She hesitated, then exhaled. "I did." "What did you write?" "Only that she shouldn't trust the key, that it would hurt her." "Why?" "Because it hurt me." He didn't press, not yet. Did you visit him the night he died? She turned fully toward him now. No. You're certain? Yes. He studied her face for a moment longer. There was a calmness in her, but also a weight, the kind that comes not from guilt, but from carrying something alone for too long. He stood. Thank you, Madame Fournel. As he opened the door to leave, she stopped him. I think he wanted to disappear, she said, but he didn't know how. So he left pieces of himself in all of us. Maigret paused in the doorway. He didn't lock the door behind him that night, he said softly. It was left ajar. She blinked, just once, then nodded. I suppose he wanted someone to follow. On the walk back, Maigret didn't light his pipe. He had 2 keys now, and a name that had not yet surfaced. He would need to speak with the landlord again, not the one from the room near Parche. Monceau, but the concierge at the boarding house. There were still details that didn't fit. The coat buttoned, the shoes still on, the neatness, and the fact that a man who lived without keys died with one in his pocket and another hidden in a woman's drawer. By the time Maigret returned to Rue de Clignancourt, the evening had settled in with the heavy finality of a damp coat on tired shoulders. The rain hadn't returned, but the air had thickened again, and the pavements reflected the soft gleam of street lamps like pools of dark varnish. A distant radio played from a third-floor window, some nostalgic waltz, barely audible over the hush of tires and footsteps. The green sign above the boarding house door looked slightly crooked in the glow, its paint peeling in places. The smell of boiled vegetables still lingered faintly in the vestibule, mingled now with the fainter, more acrid scent of shoe polish. Maigret pressed the buzzer marked concierge, waited, then knocked gently on the wooden partition at the side of the corridor. Madame Derouet emerged moments later, tying the belt of her worn dressing gown more tightly around her waist. Her feet were in house slippers, her eyes watchful beneath a frizz of greying curls. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Maigret said, in his low, unhurried voice. "Not at all, Monsieur Maigret," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I was listening to the evening news." He followed her into the tiny back room off the hall, a space crowded with doilies, religious postcards, and a teapot that seemed permanently warm. A cage in the corner held a sleeping canary. Madame Derouet gestured toward the only chair, without an afghan draped over it. Maigret declined it with a brief motion and remained standing. "I need to ask you about that night again, when you heard the voices in Monsieur Marnat's room." She sighed and sat heavily, resting her hands on her knees. "I told you I didn't hear what was said, only that someone was with him. I understand. But you're a careful listener, Madame Derouet. You've probably overheard 1,000 things without meaning to over the years. Sometimes it's not the words themselves. It's what changes." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "There was something different, yes. That night, I mean." "Different how?" She took a moment. "Well, he usually came in quietly. I'd hear the door, the stairs, and then silence. But this time, there was hesitation. He knocked at his own door. I remember because I was startled by it. He knocked? Yes, 2 short knocks like a visitor. Then a pause, and then the sound of the door opening, a little scuffle, not an argument, just movement. Shoes, maybe. I thought it strange. Did you hear 2 sets of footsteps going in?" "I can't say for sure. I assumed it was someone else with him, but I never saw them, only the sounds." Maigret took out the second key, the one from Madame Fournel's lacquered box. "Do you recognize this?" She leaned forward slightly. "No, but I'm not surprised he had another." "You think he kept a second place?" She shrugged. "Men like that is the quiet ones. They often live more than one life. One for the hallway, one for the inside of closed doors. He studied her closely for a moment, then asked, "Did anyone else ever visit him? Ever?" Her lips pressed together. "Well, there was someone months ago. A young woman, not the one you brought up before, dark-haired. She came on a Thursday afternoon. Didn't stay long. You saw her clearly. I opened the door. She knocked, then turned as if to leave. I caught a glimpse of her coat, green with those little silver buttons they wear these days. She looked nervous." "Did you hear anything between them?" "No, but he didn't come down again that day, missed his supper." "Did she return?" "Not that I saw, but I began hearing him walking around more at night after that." Maigret fell silent for a while, the tick of the small porcelain clock on her dresser the only sound in the room. He reached into his pocket and placed the matchbox from Dieppe gently on the table. "Did he smoke?" "No, not at all." "Ever have visitors who did?" "Never smelled it, and I know the difference." He pocketed it again. "One more thing. When you found him, was there anything out of place, even slightly?" Her brow furrowed. "No. He looked peaceful, but... well..." She hesitated. "Tell me." "It's probably nothing," she said. "I'll decide that." She sighed. "His coat, it was too dry. That morning it had been raining steadily. You remember?" "I do." "And the coat he wore was thick wool. It should have been wet. At least damp at the hems, but it wasn't. It was dry. Which would mean he hadn't just come in from the street." She nodded. "And his shoes too. Polished. No watermarks." Maigret thought about that. Someone had prepared him, or he had prepared himself, for something. Not to go out, to be found. He offered her a quiet thank you and left, walking back through the misty street with a slow, deliberate step. Something small was beginning to settle, not a conclusion, not yet, but a shape forming in the fog. Back at his office, he laid out the 2 keys on his desk, then the matchbox, the button, the candy wrapper. He didn't label them. He didn't need to. He read Madame Fournel's unopened letter, the one she had written after learning of Marnat's death. It was brief, almost empty. A sentence that read like an unfinished thought. "I don't think you meant to hurt anyone, but you did." He folded it and placed it with the others. At nearly midnight, Maigret was still awake, coat off, vest unbuttoned. He sat in shirt sleeves, pipe dark, staring at the shadowed corners of the office. He didn't need more evidence. He needed to know why a man would stage his own death like an unanswered letter, or worse, invite someone to write the ending for him. The following morning broke grey and still, with no rain, but a sky like smoked glass. The city moved cautiously in the early light, its engines muffled, its footsteps hushed. Maigret stood by the open window of his office, sipping coffee from a chipped porcelain cup. The cold breeze curled around the paper files on his desk, and a tram bell clanged faintly across the river. He hadn't slept much, not from agitation, but from the way the pieces of the case had begun to settle in his mind, not aligned yet, but not scattered either. The dry coat, the silence in the room, the voices no one could identify. A man who had died dressed for a scene, not for an evening. Janvier arrived just after 8, still brushing crumbs from his coat sleeve and apologizing, with a shrug. "I went past the room again last night," he said. "There's nothing more to find. No one's been back. No inquiries." "Good," Maigret said quietly. "Let it stay undisturbed a little longer." He walked back to the desk, set his cup down, and motioned for Janvier to sit. "I've been thinking about something," Maigret said. "Something that doesn't quite fit, not in a logical sense, but in a human one." Janvier raised an eyebrow. "That room, Maigret continued. "The room near Parc Monceau. It wasn't a place for meeting, not a lover's flat. It was too bare, too clean. No trace of sentiment." Janvier nodded slowly. "Then what was it?" Maigret struck a match and lit his pipe. He didn't answer immediately. "A place to disappear," he said at last. "Not hide. Disappear." He sat in the chair across from Janvier and let the smoke drift between them. I think Marnat had been rehearsing his absence for years, quietly, piece by piece, letting go of the usual ties. No family, no friends, 2 keys, 2 women, no footprints. Janvier leaned forward. "You think he staged his death?" "No, but I think he prepared for it. He took the button from the handkerchief and placed it beside the key on the desk." "She was there," he said. "Whoever she was." The voice the concierge heard as nervous sharp. The second woman, not Fournel and not Lemoine, someone else. "You think she—" Maigret raised a hand. "I don't think she killed him. I think he wanted her there. I think he asked her to come." Janvier blinked. To witness it? To forgive it? They were silent for a moment. "She hasn't come forward," Janvier murmured. "No," Maigret said, "because she thinks her presence made it happen." He picked up the telephone and asked for a line to the Dieppe prefecture. While waiting for the connection, he tapped the matchbox gently against the edge of the desk. When the officer on the other end answered, Maigret spoke quietly. "I need a list of small hotels in your district that give out matchboxes as advertisement, especially those that cater to discreet visitors." There was a pause, then a muffled conversation, and the sound of a typewriter being shifted. Maigret waited. When the voice returned, it read off a short list. 4 names. The second one caught his attention, Hôtel des Églantines. He remembered it from an old case years ago. Quiet place, cheap but clean, run by a retired railway man and his wife. He jotted it down. "Merci," he said, and hung up. To Janvier he said, "Go there quietly. Ask about recent guests who fit. Women mid-30s traveling alone, one-night stays, especially anyone from Paris." Janvier stood. "And if they remember her?" Maigret nodded once. "Then ask where she went." Janvier left without further comment. Maigret remained at his desk, absently shifting the key in his palm. He was no longer chasing a culprit. He was following a silence, one that had lingered too long, clung to many people, and taken root in their gestures. Lemoine's eyes, Fournel's envelope, the knock that shouldn't have happened. At noon, Janvier returned, brushing rain off his sleeves. The drizzle had returned without sound. "She stayed there 2 nights, he said. Checked in alone. Didn't give a full name. Paid cash, wore a green coat with silver buttons. Said she needed quiet." Maigret nodded. "Did she leave anything behind?" "A wrapper. Same as the one in the room." "So she was with him?" Janvier hesitated. "She left a forwarding address, in case anyone came looking." He handed over a slip of paper. Maigret read it once. The address was in Montreuil, a modest district full of terraces and small houses with fenced gardens. He recognized the street. He'd been there once to question a retired postmaster about a fraud case. He rose and put on his coat. "I'll go," he said. "Alone." The sky had darkened again by the time he reached Montreuil. The address led him to a red brick house tucked between 2 shuttered grocers. A lace curtain twitched as he approached, but no one came to the door. He rang once. After a moment, a woman opened it. She was younger than he expected, no more than 35, but her face carried the wear of someone who had been older in spirit for some time. She wore no makeup, and her green coat hung on a hook just inside the door. "Yes?" "Inspector." "Maigret," he said, removing his hat. She didn't flinch, just stepped aside. He entered a narrow hallway with beige walls and the faint smell of jasmine tea. They sat in the kitchen, a small space with cracked linoleum and a yellow kettle left on the stove. "I was with him," she said before he asked. "I didn't touch him. I just sat there. He said he didn't want to be alone." Maigret didn't interrupt. "I hadn't seen him in a year. He wrote to me, asked me to come, said he had something to return." "What was it?" "A photograph of us from before." Maigret looked at her hands. They were still, not nervous, just tired. "I waited outside for a while. I almost didn't go in, but the door was ajar." "Did he speak much?" "No. He said he was tired, that he'd made mistakes, that silence was a habit he no longer knew how to leave behind." "And then?" "I made tea. He didn't drink any. He just put on his coat, sat down, and closed his eyes. I thought he was resting, but after 5 minutes he didn't move. You didn't call for help." "No, I left. I was afraid. Of being blamed. No, of being asked to explain it." Maigret nodded once. "I don't think he died because of you," he said gently. She looked up. "I know." Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, softly, like a thought returning uninvited. Maigret stood, placed his hand lightly on the table. "I won't need to speak to you again," he said. She gave a small, grateful nod. As he stepped back into the street, he felt no triumph, no certainty, only the steady rhythm of the rain and the weight of the keys still in his pocket. One for a door that no longer opened to anything, the other for a memory neither he nor anyone else could unlock. The sky was growing darker as Maigret stepped off the tram near the Quai des Orfèvres. It was not late, barely past 5, but the season lent early dusk to the city, and the clouds had thickened once more, sealing the sky like the inside, off a shut drawer. He walked the final distance on foot, his shoes echoing faintly against the slick pavement, the mist curling around the brim of his hat like smoke. Inside the building, warmth greeted him. Radiators humming, muffled voices. Behind closed doors, the muted shuffle of papers and leather soles. He nodded to the officer at the entrance, who glanced up from a crossword but said nothing. No one asked questions at that hour. In his office, the room remained unchanged. The 2 keys still rested on the blotter. The button, the matchbox, the crumpled candy wrapper. Silent evidence, personal, insignificant, but precisely the sort of traces people left behind when they tried to be forgotten. Maigret hung up his coat, then sat and reopened his notes. Not to analyze, but to listen, to read between the lines of the witness statements, the recorded times, the careful silences. Each person had told him what they thought they remembered, but memory was never honest in the way facts were. It twisted itself around guilt and longing. There was still one person he hadn't spoken to since the beginning, Aline Lemoine. She had received the anonymous note, the one warning her about the key. A note that now, in light of the other conversations, felt less like a warning and more like a confession of pain. He decided not to wait. She lived alone on the 2nd floor of a narrow building near the Rue des Martyrs. A quiet, aging block, with balconies clinging like thoughts that had nowhere else to go. When she opened the door to his knock, she wore a wool cardigan over a faded dress, and her hair was tied back with a ribbon the same color as her slippers, a shade of dusky plum. "Inspector," she said. Not surprised, but not warm either. "I'd like to return something," he said. He removed a small envelope from his inside coat pocket. Inside was the photograph, just as the woman in Montreuil had described it. A black and white snapshot, poorly lit, slightly faded. 2 figures at a table, heads leaning in. Her and Marnat. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled often, but never displayed. She took it slowly and looked down at it. Her eyes didn't change. "I didn't know he'd kept it," she said softly. "He asked someone to bring it to you," Maigret said, "before he died." She studied it a while, longer, then placed it face down on a nearby table as if to silence its voice. "I hadn't seen him in over a year," she said. "We didn't argue. There was nothing dramatic, it just faded. I thought that was what he wanted." Maigret sat in the chair beside the door, his hat still in his lap. "He was a man who needed silence," he said. "But silence, once it settles, is hard to live with." She gave a faint smile, but it held no humor. "I once asked him what he wanted," she said. "He said, space. I thought he meant time apart, but he meant distance, from everything." Maigret said, "Nothing." The room was dim, lit by a single lamp on a side table. A radio stood silent in the corner. Sheet music was spread neatly on the piano. "I never wanted to intrude on his other life," she said. "I could sense it. Something he never spoke. So of another woman, maybe, or simply memories he didn't want touched. He didn't speak of the past, did he?" "No, only what he didn't like about the present. The noise, the pace of things. Even when we were walking together, he'd stop and stare at nothing, like he was listening to a clock no one else could hear." Maigret nodded slowly. "He sent you the photograph," he said, "because he wanted to be remembered, but only once he was gone." She looked at him now, and in her eyes was something close to understanding. "Did he mean to die?" Maigret didn't answer directly. "I think he meant not to stay." She folded her hands on her lap. "Who was the woman with him that night?" He hesitated, then said gently, "Someone he had once hurt. He wanted her forgiveness." "And did she forgive him?" "I think she did," Maigret said, "but he didn't forgive himself." The silence that followed was natural, not awkward, not heavy, just a shared quiet, like two people listening to the same distant sound. When he stood to go, she walked him to the door. "You don't think it was suicide?" "I think it was permission," he said, "to stop trying." She didn't speak again, and he didn't expect her to. Outside, the rain had returned, barely perceptible, like breath against glass. Maigret walked back through the streets of the 9th, passing bakeries shutting their blinds, children being called in for supper, the routine intimacy of a city that always continued. He returned to his office and lit his pipe again. The tobacco flared and then settled into a low, steady burn. He watched the smoke rise in slow spirals toward the ceiling, then fade into nothing. On his desk, the photograph now lay between the two keys, one to a door that no longer opened, the other, perhaps, to a memory never quite locked. Maigret stared at them a long while, not thinking, not deciding, only remembering. Sometimes that was all that remained. The next morning arrived without sunlight. A thick mist had curled itself along the embankments of the Seine, softening the outlines of bridges and statues into shadows. The streets were wet again, but the rain had stopped some time before dawn. It was the sort of morning that made everything feel slower. Trams ran more quietly, footsteps were less sure, and even the pigeons in the square seemed reluctant to take flight. Maigret sat by the window of his office, his pipe unlit, a cup of black coffee cooling near his elbow. He had not touched the keys since the night before. They still lay there, parallel to one another, inert and waiting like the hands of a broken clock. He was not expecting new revelations. What remained, if anything, would not come in the form of confessions or discoveries. It would arrive in gestures, in silences, in the slow erosion of resistance that time alone could produce. Inspector Lognon knocked at the door and entered without waiting for a reply. He carried a file under one arm and wore an expression that hovered somewhere between annoyance and boredom, his usual demeanor. "I suppose it's about that man," Lognon said. "Maigret." "Yes?" Lognon set the file down. "There's nothing new. No record of life insurance, no suspicious bank activity, and no one has come to claim the body." Maigret nodded, slowly. "You don't think it was a suicide?" "I think it was a disappearance," Maigret said. Lognon gave a dry snort. "You can disappear without dying. Some people can't." The two men regarded each other in the dim office light, the silence stretching just long enough to suggest that nothing more needed to be said. When Lognon left, Maigret remained seated, one hand resting lightly on the desk blotter. He traced the edge of the matchbox with a fingertip. Dieppe, a quiet hotel, a woman who brought honey sweets, a man who asked her to sit with him one last time. He glanced at the envelope Aline Lemoine had placed face down the day before. The photograph inside hadn't changed. It still showed two people leaning toward each other, their expressions blurred but unmistakably tender. A moment already lost even before the shutter clicked. At 10:30, Janvier appeared with a slip of paper in his hand. "The coroner's report," he said. "Final version. Cause of death natural. Cardiac failure probably accelerated by emotional distress. No toxins, no foul play." Maigret accepted the slip and read it slowly. "Did they say how long he might have been sitting there?" "An hour, maybe 2. Hard to say. No sign of a struggle, no bruising, just peace." He folded the paper and placed it in the file. "Then we have everything," he said. Janvier hesitated. "And yet it doesn't feel finished, does it?" Maigret shook his head. "No, because endings rarely come all at once." Later that afternoon, after the usual paperwork was signed and filed, Maigret stepped out into the courtyard and lit his pipe. The scent of damp stone rose around him. A clerk passed by with a sheaf of papers. A cat, the stray that haunted the rear steps, slinked along the wall, pausing to look at him as if expecting something. He thought about the 2 keys again. One from Madame Fournel tucked in a box she hadn't opened in a year. The other found in Maigret's coat, dry as if placed there in advance. Neither belonged to the room where he died. And yet they were the story. Not because of what they opened, but because of what they meant. The first was a token of closeness, a gesture once offered in intimacy and left untouched after it ended. The second, carried to the end, was not functional. It was symbolic. Maigret had brought it with him like someone carrying their name in their pocket, unwilling to let it be forgotten. The weather shifted subtly. The air warmed just enough to soften the damp chill. From somewhere in the distance came the clatter of dishes in a café, the echo of laughter through an open window. Maigret walked slowly back to his office, removing his coat and hanging it on the peg behind the door. He took a sheet of paper from the drawer and began writing. Not a report, not yet, just notes, names, dates, observations, a sketch of time, not crime. René Charvet, now Madame Fournel, the keeper of a key that no longer fit any lock. Aline Lemoine, who received a photograph from a man already gone. The unnamed woman in the green coat, who sat with him in silence before he died. None of them guilty, none of them truly innocent either. Each had occupied a corner of his solitude, and in the end he had invited them all to vanish with him, one by one, in memory if not in body. At the bottom of the page, Maigret wrote a final line. He was not trying to end a life, only to finish a sentence. He set the pen down, exhaled, and watched the smoke rise. At 5 o'clock, the rain began again, a light, tapping rhythm. That blurred the view from his window and cast reflections across the files on his desk. He made no move to go home. Madame Maigret would not worry. She would have left his plate warming on the back burner, a small glass of Calvados beside it, the radio tuned to some soft evening program. He would go soon. But not yet. For now, he would sit a little longer in the quiet and wait for the rain to end. It was raining still when Maigret stepped off the tram near Rue de Clignancourt the following morning. Not heavily, just a soft drizzle that left a mist on his hat and shoulders, the kind of rain that made the city smell older. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, save for a delivery boy balancing a basket on his handlebars and the muffled clatter of shutters being opened one by one. He hadn't planned to return to the boarding house, not officially. The report was already filed, the cause of death established, and the personal effects tagged and stored. There was no procedural reason to be here. But something had not settled, not a doubt, more a quiet insistence. A voice in the back of his mind reminding him that while the case might be closed, the man at its center had not been understood. The green sign above the door still hung slightly askew. A drop of water clung to its rusted frame. Maigret pushed, opened the heavy door, and entered the narrow vestibule, where the damp smell of old wallpaper and boiled cabbage welcomed him like a familiar ghost. Madame Derouet appeared almost immediately, as though she had been waiting. "Inspector," she said, her voice low, as though softened by the rain. "I won't stay long," he said. "I only want to see the room again." She nodded once. No protest, no questions. She retrieved the key from a drawer behind the desk and handed it to him with a quiet understanding. He climbed the stairs slowly, his hand trailing the banister. Each creak in the wooden steps had its own note, familiar now, like a staircase he'd descended in a dream more than once. At the door to Marnat's room, he paused, then turned the key and stepped inside. The room was unchanged. The bed was still made, the lamp still off, the single chair still pushed neatly under the writing desk. The air was dry now, faintly sweet with the scent of aged wood and something else. Dust, maybe, or the residue of memory. Maigret stood just inside, the threshold for a long moment, letting the room speak. There had been no signs of struggle, no bruises, no cuts, not even an overturned object. Just a man in a dry coat, seated, eyes closed, as though waiting for someone who never arrived. He walked slowly to the window and opened it an inch. The sound of rain on stone drifted in, mingled with the distant trill of a tram bell and the bark of a dog from across the courtyard. He sat in the chair facing the door. This perhaps was how Marnat had sat in his final hour, dressed, waiting. Not with panic, but with a kind of deliberate stillness, as though he had staged his own departure like a letter left carefully on a desk, unsigned but impossible to ignore. Maigret reached into his coat and took out the photograph, not the original which he had returned to Aline, but a copy Janvier had made for the file. He placed it on the table in front of him. Then, beside it, the keys. One had fit this door. The other no longer matched anything. Not here, not any more. There were no clues left to uncover, no names unspoken. Only this final silence, intact, unbroken, and oddly peaceful. He recalled what the unnamed woman had told him in Montreuil. He said he didn't want to be alone. And yet, in every room he had occupied, in the rented flat near Parc Monceau, in the office at the timber firm, in this small chamber under the eaves, Marnat had surrounded himself with silence. He had loved, perhaps, been loved, possibly, but he had never permitted that love to remain near. Maigret rose and walked once more around the room. A half-step here, a turn there. The floor groaned faintly beneath him, the wardrobe remained shut, the basin empty. But near the door, just above the hook where the coat had hung, he noticed something he hadn't before. A nail, slightly bent, no longer used. And beneath it, the faintest rectangle of discoloration. Something had once hung there, a frame perhaps, or a mirror. He leaned in closer. No dust, no marks, but he felt sure of it. He stepped back, sat again. What had Maigret looked at in those final moments? What image had he wanted to leave behind for himself or for her? Perhaps the photograph, or perhaps nothing at all. Only stillness. A life reduced to keys, an envelope, and a room that no one had truly entered. Maigret rose, returned the chair to its precise place, and closed the window. He did not lock the door behind him. Downstairs, Madame Derouet waited with her hands folded, the radio playing low behind her, a song from years, ergo slightly out of tune. "Will someone be coming for his things?" she asked. "No," Maigret said, "not right away. I didn't think so. Did he ever mention a brother, cousin, anyone?" "No, just the women, and even then, only in passing." He nodded. "Keep the key," he said. She looked puzzled. "It's still his," Maigret added, "for now." He stepped back into the rain, not bothering with the umbrella. The city was quiet again, the kind of quiet that lingered more deeply after a story had ended. Back at the office, the files remained on his desk, but he didn't reopen them. He returned the copy of the photograph to its envelope, placed it alongside the items marked personal effects, and signed the accompanying tag. Then, as an afterthought, he wrote something at the bottom of the page. Not official, not for any report. Room unclaimed, key retained, door unlocked. Later that. Evening, Madame Maigret would ask him if it had been a hard day. He would say no, just quiet. She would serve dinner, pour him a glass of red wine, and the radio would play something soft in the background. They would eat in silence, comfortable, unhurried. But Maigret would think of the room, and of how a man could die surrounded by memories that no longer wished to speak. He would not tell her everything. Some stories ended with facts, others ended when there was nothing left to ask. The next morning brought a pale blue sky that did not quite match the season. The rain had passed, at least for now, and the rooftops of Paris shone faintly under a reluctant sun. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the building breathed more easily. Windows were cracked open to let in fresh air, and the familiar rustle of files and footsteps had taken on a lighter tone. But Maigret remained unaffected by the weather. He had not slept well. There was a small envelope on his desk when he arrived, cream-colored, folded once, without a stamp, not official mail. Janvier had placed it there with a paperclip, and a short note came by hand. No name, no return address. Maigret turned it in his fingers before opening it. The paper inside was thin and lightly scented, not perfumed exactly, but with a faint trace of something domestic, like lavender from a drawer. The handwriting was careful, slanted, female. He read it twice before setting it down. "I was never meant to be part of this. But I was. I only sat with him as he asked. I didn't stop him. I didn't help him either. He said he wanted someone. There, just once, without expectation. There was no signature, no mention of names, but it wasn't needed. She had written what she could, and nothing more." He folded the letter, slipped it into the same folder as the photograph and the keys, and leaned back in his chair. The final trace, the last loose thread, not tied but acknowledged. Maigret had long since given up believing that every question deserved an answer. Some were meant to remain suspended, like certain notes in music that fade without resolving. Still, there were details to finish. He walked to the record office just before noon. The clerk on duty was sorting carbon duplicates into large binders, and barely looked up when Maigret stepped inside. Final disposition of the Maigret file, Maigret said. The clerk gestured toward a form. Maigret filled it in with his usual slow, deliberate script, noting the cause of death, the classification as non-criminal, and the request for indefinite retention of personal effects. Body? The clerk asked. Unclaimed. The clerk nodded without comment. The world had already moved on. Maigret left the record office and walked slowly along the Seine. He had no destination, only a sense that his thoughts needed room to breathe. The sky above was streaked with high white clouds, and the river rolled on in its indifferent rhythm. He paused on the Pont au Change and lit his pipe. The smoke curled into the breeze and vanished. He thought about the room again. The one with the bent nail and the silent bed. The one that had received its final guest without resistance. Maigret had not locked the door, had not hidden the key. He had trusted someone to carry the rest. It was not an accident, Maigret felt, sure that all three women had held a piece of the ending. Fournel with her key and her silence, Lemoine with the photograph, the third, unnamed, unsought, with her presence at the last moment. Each had been offered a fragment, but none had been given the full story. Not even Maigret. Back at the office, he sat once more at his desk and took out the photograph one last time. It remained as it had always been, quiet, blurred, and ordinary. Yet in it lived something essential, not the mystery, but the man. That afternoon, Janvier entered with a sheaf of papers. Final clearance for the boarding house, he said. Madame Derouet wants to know when she can open the room again. Maigret took the folder, signed the release, and closed it. She can open it tomorrow, he said, but she should leave the key on the hook. Janvier paused, curious, still waiting for someone. No, Maigret said, but the story should be allowed to rest on its own terms. The younger man nodded, though he clearly did not understand. As the hours passed, the sky deepened and the light thinned. Maigret watched the shadows grow longer in the corners of the room. It was a familiar feeling. The day winding down, the unanswered questions folding themselves into drawers, waiting for time to carry them elsewhere. He packed the last of the documents into a box marked with Maigret's name. Surname only. No initial, just a name without a future. He kept the matchbox not as evidence but as a reminder that even those who choose to vanish leave behind the smallest traces, a scent, a gesture, a voice asking for silence. At 6 o'clock, Rose stretched his shoulders and reached for his coat. He walked home slowly through the city, letting the evening settle around him. A bakery was still open on the corner, its warm light spilling out onto the pavement. Children ran laughing toward the metro. Somewhere, a man played the accordion not for money, but for himself. At the door of his apartment, Madame Maigret greeted him with a gentle smile and the familiar smell of roasted chicken. He kissed her on the cheek and washed his hands at the sink while she poured him a glass of wine. "Busy day?" she asked. "No," he said, "just full." They ate in quiet harmony. Later she handed him a small plate with a slice of pear tart and returned to her knitting. He did not speak of the case. There was nothing left to explain. Just a letter with no name, and a room no one had ever truly entered, but which in the end had been shared. A week later the rain returned. Not as a downpour, but in the soft, persistent fashion of Paris in late March, misting windows, darkening stone, and blurring outlines. By the time Maigret stepped out of the building that morning, the world had already been soaked into a subdued hush. No honking, no shouting, just the sound of water sliding along gutters, the flap of umbrellas opening like cautious wings, and the low hum of trams passing without urgency. He wasn't on his way to an investigation. There was no Emergency, no appointment. He was carrying a small parcel under his arm and had asked for the day to himself, which at the Quai des Orfèvres required no explanation. The file had been closed, the belongings logged. The name of Léonard Marnat had already begun to fade from the lips of the inspectors, replaced by new cases, louder stories, more visible endings. Maigret walked down toward the river, pausing now and then beneath awnings or beside bakery windows. The morning was grey, but the city had a strange clarity to it, as if the rain had rinsed it clean of its usual confusion. He passed a florist, arranging pale yellow tulips in a metal bucket, nodded at a street sweeper, who paused to light a cigarette and eventually made his way to the small gate near the Quai des Célestins that led to the footpath along the Seine. There he found a bench beneath a tree still clinging to the memory of winter. The branches hung low, dripping gently. He sat, resting the parcel on his knees. Inside the brown paper wrapping was Marnat's raincoat, folded, pressed, still dry. It had been returned by Madame Derouet with the rest of the effects, but Maigret had not wanted it to sit in a storeroom. He had not wanted it buried either. There was something about the coat that felt too deliberate to discard, not sentimental, but symbolic. He thought of how it had been found, worn, buttoned, too dry for the weather, worn not for warmth but as a final gesture, a uniform for departure. He smoked his pipe slowly as the river moved beside him. Barges passed in the distance, silent, but steady. A gull landed on the railing, shook its wings once and remained still. The water was the same as always, grey-green, impenetrable, constant. There had been a time, years ago, when Maigret might have lingered on what had gone unsaid, might have puzzled over the absence of a proper confession, the lack of motive wrapped in forensic proof. But now, in the long rhythm of his years, he had come to understand that some stories chose not to end sharply. They dulled themselves, they dissolved. He unfolded the coat and ran his hand once along the fabric. The weight of it. The silence stitched into every seam. He thought of the 3 women, Renée, who had loved him quietly and left him quietly, Aline, who had tried to remember him and been met with absence, and the third, the unnamed, who had accepted the weight of his final moment and walked away without asking for recognition. Each had received a fragment, and all 3 had respected the silence. Maigret stood and approached the edge of the river. The raincoat hung from his arm now, like a memory unwilling to be folded again. There was a moment, not long, where he considered keeping it, perhaps leaving it with the rest of the belongings, letting it be catalogued and forgotten, but that would be wrong. That was not what the coat was meant for. He bent slightly and released it, not into the water but over the railing, into a collection bin beside the path, the kind used for donations, kept for the homeless or the poor. Someone would wear it again, not because it had belonged to Léonard Marnat, but because life had to continue, and Maigret believed in continuations more than conclusions. He turned from the river and began to walk, slowly, without direction, letting the rhythm of the wet streets and the shuffle of passing footsteps carry him forward. It was not until the early afternoon that he returned home. Madame Maigret greeted him with a warm expression and a knowing glance, not curious, not prying. He removed his coat, shook off the rain, and set his hat on the peg. They ate lunch together, leek soup, a bit of cheese, and a crust of bread. Still warm from the oven. Neither spoke of work or of death. They listened instead to the radio, which played a soft waltz from another decade, and sipped tea while the rain streaked the glass in long, quiet lines. Later, Maigret sat in his chair by the window, pipe in hand, eyes watching the clouds shift in colour. The day was growing darker again, but it was a comfortable darkness, not threatening, not hollow. simply the kind that arrives naturally, when a story has finished what it meant to say. He reached for a notebook, not one used for reports, but the small one he kept for himself, a habit he seldom spoke of. In it he recorded endings, not facts, not statements, just thoughts, that came after a case had closed. He wrote, "He wore the coat to be remembered. He left the key to be understood. He asked for company not to confess, but to be seen. That was his story, not mine." He closed the notebook and set it aside. Outside, the rain slowed to a mist again. The city exhaled, and the Seine flowed on,